There's a town in America that doesn't exist on most maps anymore. Not because it was abandoned, not because it burned down or flooded, but because the people who lived there stopped being able to leave. And after a while, they stopped wanting to. By the 1930s, every child born in that town had the same sloping forehead, the same crooked smile, the same eyes. Doctors who visited couldn't explain it. Priests wouldn't talk about it. And the parents, they just kept having more children. What you're about to hear isn't folklore. It's not an urban legend whispered around campfires. This is documented history, census records, medical reports, court testimonies that was quietly sealed away for nearly a century. The kind of story that makes you wonder what else we've been taught to forget. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The town had a name once. For the sake of the descendants still living. Yes, some are still alive. We'll call it Hollow Creek. It sat in a valley so deep and isolated that even during the logging boom of the early 1900s, no company bothered to cut through. The roads in were barely roads. The roads out, well, most families never used them. It started with 3 families, just 3. They arrived sometime in the 1820s. Settlers looking for cheap land and distance from the law. What they found was a place so remote, so forgotten that they might as well have landed on another planet. And for the next 100 years, those 3 families stayed. They built a church. They built homes. They built a school with 1 teacher, who was also the preacher's daughter, who was also someone's cousin, who was also someone's wife. And then, without anyone noticing, they started to build something else. A genetic trap that would take 4 generations to spring. The first official record of something being wrong came in 1889. A traveling physician named Dr. Raymond Caldwell passed through Hollow Creek on his way to a lumber camp further north. He stopped to water his horse and was invited to stay for supper by a family named the Pritchards. What he saw at that dinner table would haunt him for the rest of his life. He wrote in his journal, a journal that wouldn't be discovered until 1978, tucked in a university archive, that he counted 11 people at the table, but he could only distinguish 4 distinct faces. The father and 2 of his sons looked virtually identical, not just in feature, but in age. The mother and her 3 daughters had the same severe underbite, the same wide-set eyes that seemed to look past you rather than at you. 2 of the children, he noted, had 6 fingers on their left hands. No one remarked on it. No one seemed to think it unusual. Dr. Caldwell didn't stay the night. He left before dawn and never returned to that valley. But he wrote 1 sentence in his journal that researchers still reference today. I have seen the future of a family that has no future. He didn't understand what he was looking at. How could he? Genetics as a science barely existed. Gregor Mendel's work on inheritance was only just being translated into English. The word inbreeding was used for livestock, not people. But Dr. Caldwell knew enough to recognize that something had gone fundamentally, biologically wrong. By the turn of the century, Hollow Creek had a population of about 200 people. Church records show that nearly all of them shared one of 3 last names: Pritchard, Goins, or Tolmage. Births were registered. Marriages were recorded. But if you trace those records, and historians have, you start to see the same names appearing in loops. A Pritchard man marries a Goins woman. Their daughter marries a Talmage man. His sister marries back into the Pritchards. Round and round, generation after generation. There were no strangers in Hollow Creek. No one moved in. And critically almost no one left. The valley became a closed genetic system, a biological echo chamber where the same traits, the same blood, the same damaged chromosomes repeated and amplified with each new birth. And then the children started to change. By 1910, teachers in the county, those brave enough to make the journey into Hollow Creek, began filing reports that were quickly buried by the local school board. Children who couldn't speak by age 7. Children who couldn't read by age 12. Not because they weren't taught, but because something in their minds wouldn't let the letters hold still. One teacher described a classroom where 5 students, all from different families, had the exact same facial structure. She quit after 3 weeks and refused to ever speak about it publicly, but she did speak about it privately. In a letter to her sister discovered in an estate sale in 1989, she wrote, "They look at you with eyes that seem too old and too young at the same time, like they know something terrible is coming, but they don't have the words to tell you. I don't think they have the words for anything." The physical signs were becoming undeniable. Infant mortality in Hollow Creek during this period was estimated at 40%. 40%. For comparison, the national average at the time was around 10%, and that was considered a crisis. But in Hollow Creek, burying children wasn't a tragedy. It was routine. The cemetery behind the church had more graves for infants than adults. Some families lost 5, 6, 7 children before one survived past the age of 5. And yet they kept going. They kept marrying within the same families. They kept having children because in their minds this wasn't abnormal. This was simply life. When everyone around you shares the same blood, the same struggles, the same quiet tragedies, you stop seeing them as tragedies. You see them as the way things are, the way things have always been. One census taker in 1920 noted something chilling in his report. He wrote that he asked a mother how many children she had. She said 3. He asked how many she'd given birth to. She paused, counted on her fingers, and said 9. When he asked what happened to the others, she looked at him like he'd asked a stupid question. They didn't take, she said, like they were seeds that failed to sprout. The state knew. That's the part that makes this story so much darker. The state of Virginia. Because yes, Hollow Creek was real, and it was in the Appalachian corner of southwestern Virginia had records. They had reports. They had doctors who'd visited, census data that showed the same surnames intermarrying for generations, and health officials who documented the physical and mental disabilities spreading through the population like a slow-motion plague. And they did nothing. It didn't fit the narrative. It was white people, rural people, people who were supposed to represent the backbone of America. Acknowledging what was happening there would mean acknowledging that isolation and poverty could destroy a bloodline just as thoroughly as anything the eugenicists feared. So the reports were filed and forgotten. The teachers who complained were quietly transferred. The few journalists who tried to investigate were politely turned away, told there was nothing to see, that these were just poor mountain folk who kept to themselves. And the people of Hollow Creek, they learned not to ask outsiders for help because help never came. There's a court record from 1928 that's almost unbearable to read. A woman named Edith Goines tried to petition the county for medical assistance for her son who was 12 years old but couldn't walk, couldn't feed himself, and had seizures that left him unconscious for hours. The petition was denied. The reason given was insufficient funds. But the real reason, buried in the margins of the clerk's notes, was simpler. Family situation self-inflicted. Self-inflicted. As if a child born with a broken body and a broken mind had chosen his parents. As if generations of isolation and poverty had been a deliberate decision rather than a trap that tightened with every passing year. By the 1930s, Hollow Creek had become a ghost town that was still alive. The population had dropped to fewer than 150. The church still stood, but services were irregular. The school had closed. Families lived in cabins that were rotting from the inside, held together by habit and desperation. And the children, those who survived, walked the dirt roads with faces that all looked like echoes of each other, genetic photocopies that had degraded with each reproduction. No one outside the valley wanted to acknowledge they existed, and the people inside had stopped believing anyone cared. Everything changed in 1937, not because someone finally decided to help, but because someone decided to study them. A researcher from the University of Virginia named Doc Howard Pembroke arrived in Hollow Creek with a grant to study isolated populations in Appalachia. He wasn't a geneticist. He was an anthropologist, which meant he was more interested in culture than chromosomes. But what he found wasn't culture. It was a biological catastrophe that had been slowly unfolding for over a century. Dr. Pembroke spent 6 months in Hollow Creek. He measured skulls. He documented family trees. He took photographs that wouldn't be released to the public until the 1990s. And when you see them, you understand why. Faces that look simultaneously ancient and childlike. Eyes that don't quite align. Hands with extra fingers or missing fingers or fingers fused together. Children standing next to their parents. And you can't tell which generation is which because they all look the same age, worn down by the same genetic weight. He interviewed over 60 residents. Most couldn't read. Many couldn't hear. A significant number had cognitive impairments that made conversation nearly impossible. But the ones who could talk told him stories that made him physically ill. Stories of babies born without brains. Of children who screamed constantly because their bones grew wrong and caused them endless pain. Of a teenager who gave birth to a child with 2 heads that lived for 3 hours before dying in her arms. And through it all there was this eerie acceptance. No anger. No grief that looked like grief. Just a quiet, hollow acknowledgement that this was normal. This was life in Hollow Creek. Dr. Pembroke's research was never officially published. His notes were sealed. The university claimed it was to protect the privacy of the subjects, but researchers who've accessed the files believe it was something else. It was shame, institutional shame, that this had been allowed to happen in America in the 20th century in a state that prided itself on civilization and progress. The military didn't come to Hollow Creek looking for soldiers. They came looking for land. In 1942, the federal government began seizing property across Appalachia for military training facilities and infrastructure projects. Hollow Creek sat on a ridge that happened to be strategically useful for a radio relay station. Eminent domain notices were sent. Families were given 60 days to relocate. Most had never left the valley in their entire lives. Some had never left their family's property. The dispersal was chaotic and brutal. Families who'd lived within a mile of each other for 5 generations were suddenly scattered across 3 counties. Some went to live with distant relatives they'd never met. Others ended up in boarding houses in small towns where people stared at them in the streets. Children were enrolled in schools where teachers didn't know what to do with them, where other students mocked their appearances, their speech, the way they moved. Medical examinations became mandatory for the first time. And that's when the outside world finally saw the full scope of what had happened. County health records from 1943 show that of the 37 children from Hollow Creek enrolled in public schools, 22 had severe congenital disabilities, 14 were classified as mentally deficient by the standards of the time. 9 were deaf. 6 had skeletal deformities that required surgery, and almost all of them showed signs of what we now recognize as genetic disorders caused by successive generations of inbreeding. The term the doctors used in their reports was hereditary degeneration. They meant it scientifically, clinically, but the families heard it as something else. As confirmation that they were broken, that their blood was poisoned, that everything their parents and grandparents had built, the community, the survival, the stubborn persistence in that isolated valley had been a mistake. Some families tried to hide their origins. They changed their names, lied about where they came from, told their children never to mention Hollow Creek. Others simply gave up. There are records of parents surrendering their disabled children to state institutions, places with names like the Home for the Feeble-Minded and the Virginia Colony for Epileptics and the Mentally Deficient. Places where those children would spend the rest of their lives locked away, forgotten twice over. By 1950, Hollow Creek was completely empty. The cabins, the DNA test connected her to dozens of distant cousins, all branching from the same 3 families, all carrying the same markers. She reached out to some of them. Most didn't respond. The ones who did asked her not to contact them again. The shame, even now, 3 generations later, is still too heavy to carry in public. But here's what haunts me most about this story. Hollow Creek wasn't unique. It wasn't even rare. Throughout Appalachia, throughout isolated rural America, there were dozens of communities like this. Some even more extreme. The difference is that most of them were never documented, never studied, never acknowledged. They just slowly faded away and we pretended they never existed. We like to think of America as a place of opportunity, of mobility, of endless possibility. But for some people, for some families, America was a trap. Geographic isolation became genetic isolation. Poverty became a prison with walls made of mountains and roads that led nowhere. And the children paid the price for circumstances they never chose and could never escape. The cemetery at Hollow Creek still exists. You can find it if you know where to look, though the state won't tell you, and locals will actively direct you away. The headstones are mostly unreadable now, covered in moss and thyme. But if you count them, you'll find more than 300 graves in a space meant for maybe 100. Most of them are small children's graves, infants who never had a chance. There's no historical marker, no memorial, no acknowledgement that this place ever mattered or that the people who lived here ever existed. Just forest, silence, and the quiet understanding that some stories are too disturbing for us to remember. So we bury them like those children, and we walk away. But they happened. Hollow Creek happened. And if we forget it, if we let it disappear completely, then we're just guaranteeing it will happen again. Maybe not in the same way. Maybe not in a valley in Virginia, but somewhere to someone in some community we've decided isn't worth saving. That's the real horror. Not what happened in Hollow Creek, but how easily we let it happen. And how quickly we agreed to forget. If this story disturbed you, if it made you think, if it reminded you that history isn't just dates and wars, but real people suffering in real places, leave a comment. Share this video. Make sure their story doesn't disappear completely.